Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for all they've done to bring us together here today to have some interesting conversations. I'm going to present in English, but I've left the slides in French. Et je peux répondre aux questions en français si on veut. What I'm going to talk about today I'm going to kind of do something not exactly contradictory, but I think challenge some of the rhetoric of decolonization that seems to become sort of embedded in a lot of archaeological literature during the last almost 20 years. And a lot of it stems from the field of what in the Anglophone world is called indigenous archaeology. And in fact, I think we can acknowledge the slightly awkward place that sits in when we span the kind of Anglophone Francophone divide, with indigène seen as kind of pejorative and inappropriate in Francophone contexts, and then the French equivalent autochtone not really translating in a simplistic way into the Anglophone literature. So there's kind of, I think, an interesting disconnect in our regional discourse that we could probably talk about, but that's its own presentation. I'll leave that to the side for now and just recognize that I'm going to refer to this term indigenous throughout in its kind of Anglophone usage. So there's an extensive literature around decolonization within archaeology. And I think one of the things that we need to be very aware of in the way that the terminology has been used is in archaeological spaces, I would say it's mostly about a kind of decolonization of ideas. And the part that we haven't done a good job of is, and this is where I think a lot of indigenous scholars would probably push back on against what gets called decolonized or decolonizing archaeology, is the very real ongoing project of fundamental transformations of global political economy, race relations, and other forms of very real lived oppression. I don't think archaeology actually has, at this point, contributed in a substantive way to those parts of the decolonization project, which I think we can all acknowledge are, there's a reason for that, right? It's very easy to change what we say and how we write about things and how we think about things. The other projects that are around actually transforming the social conditions that we live with are a lot more difficult and more time consuming and more often sit at odds with the kind of professional expectations in our profession, whether we sit in industry or in academia or in museums even. Again, thinking about the idea of where a lot of this work comes from, the kind of foundational work for a lot of Anglophone people, particularly in the kind of Australia and Asia Pacific region, has been Linda Tuivai-Smith's work, Decolonizing Methodologies, now in its third edition, originally published again over 20 years ago, which really lays out a framework. And I think what's critical in Tuivai-Smith's work is that she emphasizes this idea that decolonization is not, it cannot simply be a theoretical project, right? It cannot simply be about changing our rhetorical habits, changing the language we use to talk about things. It also has to be about working on projects that help to move indigenous people from, as Tuivai-Smith puts it, sort of survival to actually really driving not only the research agenda, but the broader societal context within which research occurs. Moving a little bit closer to home in Polynesia, we can point to the work of people like Kathy Kavelu in Hawaii, who's been really kind of instrumental in reframing the Hawaiian archaeology agenda from a Kanaka Maoli perspective, and even more recently for Tahiti. There's a recent paper by Pauline Reynolds and Vehio Wheeler about sort of trying to articulate what a Maohi research agenda would actually look like. And again, these are really, I mean, at this point, these are fragments. It's an 8-page paper versus how many thousands of pages of humanities and social science literature from this region. So we're talking about something that kind of doesn't even really exist yet in any kind of concrete form, but where I think it's a really important probably moment for us as the kind of language of decolonization becomes fairly ubiquitous, not only in academia but more broadly in society, to think about, what does Polynesian archaeology actually do, or where does it sit in relation to these kind of emerging conversations. Um, I'm going to outline a couple of problems, but I don't want to dwell on them too much. He says, having just, flown in from spending 2 weeks doing kind of community embedded research in the Gambia, and then flying back to an academic conference at a university. But there is this ongoing question of for research, and especially sort of field research in the fieldwork based disciplines. What do we do with this problem that we work with these communities? We often develop very deep relationships with the people in these communities. We become involved in their lives, their family lives, their professional lives, their personal lives. But at the end of the day, and I think this is one of these contradictions that leaves a lot of this potential unrealized, all of us go back to whatever big institution we work for, whether it's an archaeological consultancy or a university or a museum, usually in a capital city, somewhere in a settler colony outside of the Polynesian region. For many of us, not for all of us, but that there is this kind of ongoing issue of really how can we adjust institutional and professional expectations to kind of better fit with the reality that you actually have to spend a lot of time in these kind of communities to build real relationships with people and do research that kind of speaks to them on their own terms. And more broadly, I think the bigger problem that sort of smarter museum scholars than me have talked about is this idea that decolonization, in fact, just becomes another form of branding that institutions like universities and museums can use to signal a certain kind of virtue to the outside world, right? So the very nice, for example, land acknowledgement that my colleague gave a couple presentations ago has become the standard opening for any presentation in an Australian university. And it's very nice to sort of signal to the outside world that we recognize that we all live and work on stolen land, until institutions like universities do anything along the lines of trying to give some of that land back. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's sort of an empty gesture that you can use to maybe make yourself feel a little bit better about your white guilt, but it's not actually changing anything about the colonial social arrangements that organize the world we live in. Turning to historical archaeology, one of the things about this subdiscipline within Polynesian research is that its development has been historically very uneven. So in European settler colonies, particularly British settler colonies like New Zealand and Australia, it's been very highly developed. These are sort of global leaders in the field of post-European colonial archaeology. Certainly Hawaii has been a place where there have been some really important studies during the last 30 years or more. And then in the rest of the Pacific, including in Polynesia, it's kind of here and there. It's particular projects, it's particular researchers. And so there's a lot of scope to expand what we do in this field. Not only going geographically to different islands, but also trying to move away from the kind of very heavy emphasis that's traditionally been on British colonial activities in the Pacific, to start to think about not only Francophone, but also German, Japanese, American, Russian, etc. Right? All these other colonial powers that had their Pacific empires during the last 200 years or so. I always think of historical archaeology as sitting somewhat uncomfortably in relation to living oceanic communities. It is, on the one hand, I think, a very important kind of topic for people to understand how we get from what's often cast as, for better or worse, a kind of, quote, pristine, pre-European, traditional, autochthonous or indigenous culture, and the very messy modern world that we live in with, smartphones and automobiles and all the other kind of things that people live with. in their daily lives. That kind of tracing the trajectory between how we get from one state to the other, as the last presentation I think outlined very well, is a really important kind of work to do to help to kind of get us to that space. And I think one of the possibilities within historical archaeology is this idea of counter discussions, counter narratives, counter histories, counter mapping of these colonial pasts in order to show the ways that they were shaped by the colonized people who are often left out of the written accounts left to us by Europeans. So I'm going to do a couple of very, very fast examples before I wrap up, just to show sort of some of the things that my colleagues and I have worked through in recent years. This is from research that I did with Mark McCoy, building on original surveys by Pat Kirch in Kalaupapa on the island of Molokai, which was the 19th century Hawaiian leprosy settlement. And there are a variety of traditional sites of Hawaiian religious worship called heiau, similar to the marae in central Polynesia. And their locations are often embedded within the transformed colonial landscape. So for example, Father Damien, another one of these kind of well-known Père des Sacré-Cœurs, European missionaries, robbed this heiau at a place called Makali'i, which I think is a name that probably a lot of us can figure out what it's about, right? Makali'i, Matariki, Matari'i. It's a reflex of the same kind of reference to a religious seasonal change in the Polynesian order. And the stones were robbed to build the wall for the Catholic Church. But in fact, you could argue that this is not in a way, a destruction of the kind of mana from the temple site, but rather a redistribution of it as people move from one place of worship to another. And then throughout the settlement, which I've argued is largely kind of organized along the lines of a Polynesian village or Hawaiian village, you have these kind of markers like this Pohakua Kane, a stone dedicated to the worship of the god Kane, the sort of male deity and the deity of rain-fed agriculture, inside of, again, one of the main areas of habitation during the 19th century in the leprosy settlement. Shifting very quickly to Vanuatu, and I promise I'll do this in 1 minute, even though it's difficult to skip through it so quickly. Going to some of the oldest standing stone building remains in island Melanesia. This is the house of the Presbyterian missionary John Getty, which dates to the 1850s. And my colleagues, Stuart Bedford and Matthew Spriggs, and our colleagues at the Vanuatu Cultural Center and local people on Anaitium, uncovered a series of magic stones, some of which are still remembered, which were located directly within the sort of middle of the mission complex. And which were again, some of them were remembered by local people as being there, but it's an example of this kind of rematerialization of indigenous ritual practice around the existence of a changing cosmology and changing set of religious beliefs. And then, as Matthew and I have argued in a different one of our papers, the monumental stone church that Getty and the other missionaries built with local laborers really sits within the realm of, for Anaitiamese people, what they would call kind of custom heritage, their own customary or indigenous heritage, all the way to the point of when the Anaitiamese erected the roof over the church, the large beam at the top of the roof line was made from a kind of sacred tree that people, sort of carried the chief around, following the pattern of a traditional ritual of installation for a new kind of sacred place. And then in the south of Tana Island, one of the projects that I've done is documenting a village associated with a chiefly title that's part of oral traditions from the area, a guy called Yeni Yarisi, and looking at the kind of historical archaeology of a post kind of European landscape in terms of its chronology, that nonetheless doesn't have the kinds of large stone masonry structures that we might think of in French Polynesia, but rather a set of stone structures that were a particular rearrangement of social space within the existing landscape of South Tana. So I'm going to basically stop with that, and so a big part of historical archaeology is about these kind of rewritings of colonial history and a shifting of emphasis to the everyday lives of Pacific Islands people. Would we call it decolonization? Of course not, right? We're not actually we haven't found a good way to work within the structures that we have in, say, academic research to actually challenge some of the fundamental types of inequality that exist and will continue to exist within the world that we all inhabit, and that we're trying to find ways to work together in. So that's all from me. Thank you.